For being here. My name is Carrie Naoni, and I'm the Executive Director of TIE Oregon. Thank you again. This is the seventh webinar for our COVID response series, Unprecedented Opportunities in Digital Health and Biotech. We've got a superb panel with us today to share all kinds of great information. A few housekeeping items. This webinar will last 90 minutes and is being recorded. And we will be taking questions via the chat box. So we did receive quite a few questions during the registration process, and we'll be trying to get through as many questions as we can within this time allotment. This is again being recorded so that you can review it at a later date. Now I'd like to hand it over to TIE Charter member and TIE Oregon board member, Brigitte Pinueski. She is a physician, ex-medical executive, researcher, author, startup mentor, and TIE Oregon board and charter member. She also provides advisory services for NextCubed in both their digital health and fintech verticals. Her experience spans frontline medicine, medical administration, laboratory medicine, and supports distributed ledger applications in healthcare. All right, let's go. Take it away, Brigitte.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. Very exciting 90 minutes we have scheduled for you today. I'm just checking where, do you want to go to the next slide with our panelists? Great, yes, so we have a number of panelists and we're covering 3 areas today, mainly around, initially starting with looking at immunity passports, moving into testing, and we have Patty White for that, and then finally ending up with an unprecedented opportunity around repurposing drugs for COVID-19. We're starting off with Steve Brown. Let me just change my screen here. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with Steve. Steve Brown is a futurist, a keynote speaker, author, and advisor with over 30 years of experience in high tech. He's the former futurist and chief evangelist at Intel Corporation. He holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Engineering degree in Microelectronic Systems Engineering from Manchester University. He was born in the US and now lives with his wife here in Portland. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. I had the pleasure of working with Steve on a quick article a while back, I think a couple weeks back now. Steve, did you want to give us a bit of information around that, and then we can jump into this topic of immunity passports?
Sure, and I think I should point out, I'm actually born in the UK, not the US, which is why I have this outrageous accent. And I even managed, I didn't realize this, I wore the exact same outfit as you have in my photograph today. So I do own other clothes, everybody. So just so you know. So yeah, we had fun writing an article together, and the conceit of the article was, how can we build a pandemic-ready society? If we've learned anything in the last 2 months, it's that our world is a lot more fragile than perhaps we realized that it was, and something that we can't even see took this world that we thought was resilient and would just keep on trucking no matter what, and turned it upside down. So Brigitte and I sat and spent some time thinking about, well, okay, what would it take to build a pandemic-ready society? And there are lots of moving parts in that. At the core of it is, how do you build a pandemic-ready healthcare system? But around that, how do you build a resilient world? How do you build resilient institutions? And how do you support that central healthcare system in new ways? So we started thinking about how could you do that using today's technology. So without having to rely on waiting for magical new technology to come along to help us build that pandemic-ready society, but what would we put in place now to make that possible? So that's the starting point of what we got to.
Great. Yes, and in this topic, we wanted to focus a bit around immunity passports, because that's a very new topic for society at large. And it really reminds us that we are here in the US, but yet we're using these blanket approaches that severely impair our individual freedoms. So without any technology, we're stuck shutting down entire states, entire communities, and having a very piecemeal approach as to how to open them up. Well, I know there are many listeners today worried about privacy and security, but is there a trade-off, or is there a technology that can allow us to both protect our privacy and security, but yet have access to our immunity status and be able to use that to unlock some of the freedoms that we're restricted from today?
Yeah, you know, it's a very blunt instrument, right? Just shut down a country or shut down a state or shut down a city. What we need to be able to do is isolate individuals and get it that granular so that everybody else can go about living their lives. The way you do that is with contact tracing and with immunity passports. So contact tracing done in a way which is fully decentralized, so there's no central authority tracking where we all go. Now, in my country, where I come from, people aren't very cool with privacy invasions. In the US, my adopted country, we're certainly not hit with it here. So, you know, in order to get any kind of uptake on that, you need to have contact tracing and immunity passports done in a way which completely honors people's privacy, is fully opt-in, so you're not forcing people to do anything, but finding that balance between doing the right thing for the common good, so that we're all contributing to the common good, but also respecting the privacy needs of the individual. Now, how you do that is you can start to use these devices using Bluetooth and beacon technology to be able to track where somebody has gone. But the key is not to track where the person has gone and link it to an identity. The trick is to track the phone, know what phone has become infected, essentially, by knowing what other phones it's come into contact with and for how long and how close, and then to be able to alert the user to say, hey, what, you know, equivalently, your phone's infected. It was exposed to other phones that we think had a problem. You need to take precautions. You need to take a course of action. So there's using distributed technologies, in particular, blockchain looks like it could be a very interesting technology to build an immunity passport on top of it. We may be moving to an era where the same way that you want, when you want to go through TSA, you have to take off your shoes and go through the routine that we're all sick and tired of, but you are demonstrating, I am not a risk. The same is going to be true from an immunology standpoint, demonstrating and proving in a way that is acceptable to everybody involved that they are not a risk to others. And we may see threat levels emerge the same way that we see the 5-color threat level for terrorists. Maybe there's a 5-color threat level for pandemic or other public health issues. You're starting to see some countries already adopt that. So those are the sorts of things that we talked about in that article, Brigitte.
Right. And in parallel with track and trace, we are starting to see the ability of at-home testing. So doing an at-home test similar to a pregnancy test, but in this case, doing a finger prick and dropping that onto cassette and seeing whether you have antibodies to COVID or not. These tests done in isolation without being viewed by health professionals are difficult to certify. And so it would be difficult to put that information on your immunity passport without calling up a healthcare professional to help you ensure that you are in fact yourself, that you're not some other Steve, and that you are having the test results that are being showed on the cassette with you. And so we see that as a kind of an analog model, the first model of certifying home testing for individuals in this COVID-19 period. How do you see that moving forward where we don't need the professional in the loop, say, because that's not very scalable?
Right, and that's the big issue. If you want to build a pandemic-ready society, it has to be resilient across the board, and you particularly need a resilient and scalable healthcare system. So one of the ways you make a healthcare system scalable is you semi-automate it so that you're using technology to support the efforts of the clinicians and the others working in the healthcare system, and you can scale when you need to by helping people do things remotely at home. So in order to make sure that when you're having someone attest and share a test result that it's them doing it, you need to be able to link that and validate that it's them. So using artificial intelligence attached to sensors, attesting that and sticking it onto a blockchain can be a pretty good way of building that immunity passport and getting those results, because you're going to have to do multiple testing over time, and to be able to link those to an identity.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense, because this way you basically provide relatively tamper-proof technology, not just to the individual showing their passport to someone else, or relatively tamper-proof technology for anybody else trying to hack in. And as you said, it'll take a number of tests. You can envision being asymptomatic and doing some tests, showing up with symptoms later on, repeating your tests if they were negative previously to see whether you're starting to be positive, using a variety of tests that involve nasal swabs as well as finger pricks. So all of this accumulated information over time would put you at a risk status that would be beneficial to individuals to understand, so that you could have access to travel and or other businesses as this world unfolds in very non-homogeneous ways, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like TSA Pre or your Nexus Pass, but for a virus.
We've seen airlines already try some of this. I think the Emirates Airlines were asking folks to be able to show whether they were positive or negative. So definitely new territory, and something that we have the technology for today. Do you see any gaps in the technology currently, or what are your impressions? How long would it take to set something like this up, and who would be paying for this at the end of the day?
You know, I'm the futurist, so I don't deal with who pays for it or how to build it, right? That's the nice thing about being a futurist. I come up with the ideas and then say, okay, go implement it. No, I used to be an engineer once, and I think we're close to having the technology pieces. This is really a systems assembly exercise. It's not really developing new technology. My futurist brain tells me the issue here is not the technology that we have to create here. It is going to be getting people to embrace it, and to be able to demonstrate to them that this can be implemented in a way that is not Big Brother, and that is being done for the common good, and to protect individuals rather than to rob them of their rights. I think that's a bigger barrier than anything that I see technologically. I think technologically this is very doable today.
Yes, yes, and I agree. We do have a number of the building blocks already in place, certainly around self-sovereign ID, using the blockchain with Sovereign and Uport and others, working to ensure that the individual is in control of their identity management across a number of different systems. There's also one of our cohorts at NextCube, Tribe Health. They're offering video supported visits and personal data management, also on a blockchain, again, supporting the individual as the owner and controller of their data at all times. So I see these sorts of things as you said, matter of combining to create the final product. Then just touching on payment, because I know we had some questions in preparation for this session around who pays for this. One of the big winners in the current COVID scenario has been the payer, actually, because the payer has seen much of the elective procedures and visits all disappear. So the anticipated cost for insurers and payers for this period of time has dropped dramatically. And we see that across other insurers, such as car insurance. Car insurance carriers are returning funds to their members. But I'm not sure, I haven't seen any evidence of health payers returning funds at this point. Are you aware of any behavior?
I'm not, but I think you're right. There'd be multiple different business models that could fund such a development. I mean, you can see consumers paying for an app that they can use to attest, or to at least know what kind of risk they have been at. You can see healthcare providers, insurers doing such a thing. You can see maybe third parties coming into play here to fund such apps and then try and make money out of them. So I think the business model for it is yet to be sorted,
right?
But the technology is there, and I think the societal need is there, and that's the key.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of design space here to do things differently for different use cases and different locations. Absolutely. Let's see, there's No, that's not for this question. Anybody else, Patty or Kalpana, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask before we move over to the next section with Patty?
I had one question, Steve. I'm just interested to know whether you think that this change that we're going through right now, with all the restrictions that we have that no one ever dreamed about 2 months ago, will that really change our readiness to start to look at some of these types of systems that are, you know, more flexible, but of course very different than what we're used to?
Absolutely. I think about this time in lots of different frames, but one of the frames is it's the great accelerator. It is accelerating things that were already going to happen, whether that's automation efforts, digitization efforts, increase in home delivery, those sorts of things. It's also the great defroster, the great unfreezer. Systems that were rigidly frozen in place, either because of tradition, regulation, whatever it might be, out of necessity, we've had to unfreeze those systems. And you've seen that in healthcare, in education, in many different businesses out there. So the question is, if this is the big defroster, how will it freeze back into shape? So this is a time to drive innovation, to drive change, because 5 years from now, when we're looking at this in the rearview mirror, hopefully, we're going to be in a new world, and we get to decide right now what that new world looks like. So that's why I'm pushing on these types of ideas, because this is a moment where there is much more fluidity and much more opportunity to drive change than there has been in probably a decade or more.
Yes, very good point. One of the questions were around HIPAA relaxation, so the defrosting of HIPAA regulations. And clearly that has enabled clinicians to use Zoom and other meetings to correspond with their patients, which was absolutely necessary. And what it also does is allow us to have a little look under the hood. What does the world look like when it's defrosted? Is it as well protected as we thought by having these institutions in place? Or was there perhaps overreach by those institutions and the expectations of harm were perhaps overstated? I know back in the day when HIV was early days, we were very restricted as to how we would test and how we would let people know about HIV status, all under the guise of protecting those individuals. And that has changed dramatically since, and we've actually found out that in that example specifically, being overprotective of individuals was actually harm with respect to the HIV situation. And so I think there's much to learn from this scenario that we're currently experiencing. Thank you very much, Steve. I hope you have time to stay with us and share your thoughts as we move through some of the other topics.
Yeah, well, can I share one more idea here, which is that this is also testing false assumptions. It's not just testing regulatory boundaries or traditional boundaries. For example, in the NHS in the UK, they had really shied away from telehealth, using your phone to talk to your doctor, because the assumption was, well, people don't really want that. Guess what? They're trying it and they're loving it. So very often there are things that we're not doing, not because there's any reason not to, it's just we're making a false assumption. Like bosses had assumed for a long time that people couldn't work from home without goofing off. And now they're finding out, actually people can, and they can be very productive.
Yeah, no, very good point. And that leads us nicely into our next session, because David, one of our listeners, has brought up the point that everything we're talking about, of course, is dependent upon very accurate testing. And we don't seem to be there yet with the biology that we're seeing on the lateral flow tests. There are examples of an individual taking 4 tests, 4 lateral flows, and having 4 different results. So that is going to be a big barrier to getting us to the place where immunity passports work, because they're based on science first. And if the science isn't working, then the immunity passport's not going to work either. But hopefully Patty will be able to share some serious light on that for us as we move to her section. Patty is, sorry, oh, my screens are moving around. Just want to introduce Patty. She is the co-founder and CEO of Hemix Health. Turn this off. Hemix Health develops life-changing diagnostics for low-resource settings. Their Gazelle platform has malaria and sickle cell disease today, and they are currently developing a COVID-19 test. Patty holds an MBA from the Wharton School of at the University at Pennsylvania and a degree in international business from the University of Washington. Patty, you take us to this wide area around testing and accuracy.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And, you know, this whole area of diagnostics, I think all of us who probably didn't even think about diagnostic tests 3 or 4 months ago, you know, it's really never become a more prevalent or, you know, top of mind issue. For me personally, you know, my daughter moved to the UK at the end of January, and, you know, I got this call from her the 1st of March, and she said, I've just been at a meeting in Iceland for 2 days working with another company. The guy I was working with, you know, the day after I got home to London, he said, I've just been confirmed that I'm positive for COVID-19. And so, you know, she and her boyfriend both quarantined themselves, and 5 days later, they both got really sick.
Oh, no.
And in London, you know, you're supposed to call this number. Steve probably knows what it is, where you're going to get told where to go, because there were secret locations set up where they were going to run diagnostics. Each day she called, they said, we'll tell you tomorrow where to go. It went on like that for 4 days. And finally, by the end of the week, they said, we are not going to have these testing centers anymore. You will not get tested unless you get admitted into the hospital. And, you know, don't come to the hospital unless you're really short of breath. And then in that case, call an ambulance and come to the hospital. So, yeah. So, you know, she's fine now. Her boyfriend's fine. They both were sick for a couple of weeks. They never got tested, and they still have not gotten tested now that they're better. So, you know, I just want to, because I kind of lived through this personally during the same time we were working on our diagnostic tests, is that clearly we're all facing a lot of frustration. The area is evolving pretty quickly. So I just thought it'd be helpful. I brought a graphic just to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about diagnostics, because I think a lot of you have heard, you know, there's several hundred diagnostic tests being developed. Mm-hmm. I like this little graphic. Go ahead, Gita, did you have a question?
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, Carrie, if you want to pull that up, that would be great.
Yeah. So, you know, really what you see here is there are 2 different real big buckets of tests. You know, one is the diagnostic test, which happens, you know, as they were saying, even before you start your symptoms. You may, you know, you're going to have, be giving off, you may be communicable to other people. You obviously have the virus. You can be tested and found very early on, and it may be in low amounts, it may be higher amounts. They're still trying to figure that out. And then as you start to go through the illness, you can see your diagnostic test load starts to drop down. So you're going to kind of reach a point where you're no longer going to be identified by diagnostic tests. And these diagnostic tests, you've probably also heard, you know, they're either putting this very painful swab, you know, into your nose and mouth. Although now they're starting to transition a little bit towards maybe saliva, or even the sputum is going to be more potent. I mean, we're really trying to figure out where is the richest sample of the virus. So that part's happening, and that's really the diagnostic area, so that you know you can get treated, you can confirm what you have, and hopefully that'll be really helpful once we have better treatments. The second test that you hear a lot about, the second bucket, is really this antibody testing. And these come up over time. They come up later in the course of the illness, and they hang on for a period of time. Now, that's one of the things we're also trying to understand. How long are you going to have immunity? You know, how high does it need to be? I think because a lot of people know as much about these coronaviruses. Will it last for 1 season? I think most people believe it'll last for a couple of months, and you may get your passport, but then at that point, maybe you have to get it extended by having a vaccine. But you know, this is something everybody wants to know. And within each of these 2 big buckets are either high-end laboratory tests. You know, you've probably heard of PCR, you know, which is kind of the standard molecular test looking for RNA. And there are also antigen-based tests that will work in this very front-end diagnostic portion. And that's where we're working, our Hemix is working. Or then on the back-end part for the antibodies, you can also have your test run on a large machine. And some of the big companies are just gotten a few approved in the last week. or it could even be a lateral flow test. And again, these other tests in the antibody portion are from your blood. So, you know, two really different buckets of tests. There are, you know, both, so there's lab-based tests and there's point of care tests in both of these areas. Most of the home-based tests right now that you read about are really sampling at home and putting it in something and shipping it in to get tested. So, and I think there's a huge amount of variety in terms of accuracy of these tests. So, you know, I think that as everybody knows, you know, our FDA is doing, you know, an emergency use access, and which is, I think, the right thing to do to get the tests on the market. But, you know, that really means that as a manufacturer, you've tested 30 positives and 30 negatives. And I can tell you from spending, you know, last 20 years in diagnostics, you don't really know that much about your diagnostics until you've tested a few hundred people, and, you know, you'll really find out, and you may tune it or adjust it. But there's been a lot of news about the diagnostic that Donald Trump showed in his press conference, you know, the one which is a low-end diagnostic for, or basically a point of care diagnostic, but fairly expensive. And, you know, that's now come out that it was 48, only may have missed as much as 48% of the people, or missed 30%. So I think this whole area is going to have a lot of turmoil that's going to be going on. And I think, you know, it's going to take a few months to get sorted out. But I think the good news is right now, I checked last night, there's 657 tests in development right now, according to FIND. And that we don't even have ours in there. So there's probably another 400 that aren't even listed. So I think there's going to be a lot more diagnostics out there. And I think it's going to depend a lot on all of us as patients and listening to our providers as to which ones we can really trust. So that's just a little bit of background. Let's see what else I can tell you. Just really relating to what Steve had said too, is that you know, South Korea is a great example of a place that really suffered during the SARS and MERS. You know, they were very resistant to centralized testing, and yet, you know, they had a very troubling outcome. So this time, the government was really ready and really offered within the first, like by the early March, they had already tested 145,000 people at different test stations, drive-through test stations that you could go through. And if you compare the US to South Korea, and we were about at the same point at the end of March, and if you look at April, in April, South Korea had a total of 85 deaths. In April, in the US, we had 85 people dying per hour. So we have 62,000 people in the month of April. And yes, you know, we are 6 times bigger, but we just had no organization to our testing program. And I would say even now, it's pretty crazy. I mean, I just talked to one of our investors who was very sick just 2 weeks ago, and he was told he couldn't go anywhere and get a test. He didn't meet the criteria, even though he was really sick and, you know, had quarantined himself. So, you know, I think you really see the dramatic impact you can have on a society with strong diagnostics. And, you know, the question is, okay, so how many tests do we need to be taking? I mean, right now, I just saw from the CDC, we've taken 10.8 million tests, with 1.5 million of those were positive. But, you know, how many per day should we be taking? Some people say we should be able to take 5 million tests a day. Right now, we can only take about 350K a day. So, you know, I think we've got a ways to go on diagnostics. And I think it's something that is going to be in the news for all of us. And it's not easy to understand and figure out. Even for me, you know, being in the diagnostic space, you know, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen.
So Patty, that's so true. I've heard numbers up to 30 million per week is what we should be testing, or at least targeting, which we're so far away from. How has this impacted your funding strategy and or your, you know, your work with investors?
So for HEMIX, I mean, we have a diagnostic platform. I have it here, you see it. It's really a small device that can run tests. It's meant for laboratories, you know, and hospitals in Africa and India, places. All our tests are really designed to be high volume tests and low cost. but also really accurate. I mean, just because you want to test fast and affordable doesn't mean you can give up on accuracy. So for us, it really meant that we had completed this platform for malaria and sickle cell. So we saw COVID-19 as an opportunity to really expand our business, not actually pivoting, but just, getting in the fast lane for a while, because we knew we could bring something we already have. We have a fundamental technology called electrophoresis on this test that we could just take our same cartridge we use for sickle cell disease and load it with an assay for COVID and run it on our machine. So we really see some opportunities. It definitely has expanded some of our conversations with different partners, different investors. I think we're really, heads down right now on really just getting our proof together in the next, and our testing, so that we feel comfortable we can apply for regulatory clearance probably in the next month. So it definitely opens up more possibilities, because maybe this is a test your doctor's office can run. It's
Right.
not just in a hospital in Africa. One thing the US FDA told us just recently was they want more diagnostic tests that are small like this, that it's not going to solve the problem with just large laboratory testing. We just won't have the volume, and we won't have the proximity, because you don't want somebody waiting 5 days for a test result.
Right. Will it change your time to approval and cost to approval?
Well, definitely. I mean, the emergency use authorization gives you approval,
But
very quickly.
Beyond though, I'm thinking.
Yeah, beyond that, I think what it gives you is a lot of for us, there's a lot of grant funding that we're applying for. There's just millions of dollars in grants that we're going to be doing. And that's definitely, hopefully, going to help us accelerate our eventual testing, in countries, and even in the US, and to be able to, I think, get an accelerated pathway to not only this test, but basically this gives us a pathway for other tests and other viruses that will come along, because I don't think this is the last one.
No, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much. That, rapid time to market and decreased costs to approval, those types of attributes are also, moving over to the therapeutic space as well. So let's move on to our last couple of panelists and talk about the therapeutic space. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kalpana Merchant. She's the founder and president. Oops. My screens keep changing. Zoom is not very kind at times. Kalpana Merchant, she is the founder and president of Transthera Consulting Company. She is also an adjunct professor, Department of Neurology, Feinberg School of Medicine, Northwestern University in Chicago. She's a neurobiologist with nearly 25 years of experience in drug discovery and development with large pharma. Kalpana is also a TIE board member and startup mentor. She received her PhD from the University of Utah and completed postdoctoral at UW. She now resides here with us in Portland. Thank you, Kalpana. And with her is Dr. Daniel Haters, who also has about 20 years of experience in healthcare as a scientist, entrepreneur, advisor, and investor. He's currently the managing director of NextCube's Digital Health Accelerator, as well as an operating partner at Sway Ventures. Daniel is a faculty member and member of the advisory committee of the UCSD Digital Health Certificate Program. And for today's topic, he's here representing Repurposed AI as their executive chairman. Thanks so much, Kalpana and Daniel. I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks. And I'm really happy to be on this panel. This is my first one for Chi Oregon. I just joined it this year. Have been in Oregon or Portland, I should say, for about 4 years. So it's fun to be on this. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Daniel and all of his expertise in this space. Carrie, if we can move to the next slide. What I'd like to do in just about 3 or 4 slides to say, none of us are, this COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic has been kind of a seismic event, as we have been discussing for the last half an hour. But as somebody who's had a lot of scars on my body to prove that drug discovery and development are not easiest things to go after. I mean, the rate of failure is the highest among any industry you can imagine. So on the left side of this slide, what I've listed are, the main reasons for failure of drugs, everything from complexity of the understanding the science around how we want to tackle a disorder, to the cost of development, which for large diseases, it can run into multi-billion dollars for one single drug. The risk, so if you start from the very beginning of identifying a molecule till the end of registration, it's only 1.5% success rate. Again, like I said, the lowest among any industry. But if you even start with something that's ready for the clinic and then look for registration, it's only 14%. And of course, the development cycles are long, disease dependent. So what COVID-19 has taught us, though, is that you can tackle drug development in this space. We understand what causes the disease, unlike many other disorders. There are major medical unmet need, including diabetes, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's that I study, et cetera, et cetera. The cost could be high, but we've realized, all of us together, that the cost of economic damage is much higher. And right now there is tremendous incentive from all levels, at National Institutes of Health. The states are giving innovation grants, non-government organizations and investors are all very much interested in developing drugs in this space. The regulatory risks are low outside of even the emergency use that we just heard about for diagnostics, which also applies to drugs. The path to approval, the regulators are much more open to being flexible on that. And then finally, the prevention trials as well as the treatment trials, given that it's a viral disease, it's much simpler than some of the other more complex disorders. And we'll dive into that further a little bit. So on the next slide, what I have are some examples of what's been happening just since February of this year. And this is from bio.org, a website that I visit almost on a daily basis, given my field. But what this shows, if you can see in February when we started, there were only 3 drugs being developed for COVID-19. And now we have more than 430 drugs. This is an unprecedented speed of drug development. I've not seen it in my 25 years of being in this field. And many of them are either vaccines or they are antivirals, or they affect different symptoms caused by the virus. So they are in that orange piece of the pie, but it's amazing. And then the next question comes up: what is underlying this level of speed of development in drugs targeting the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2? If you go to the next slide, just extremely high level, but the many technologies have been developing in the last decade or so that are being taken advantage of. So these include the genomics, the rapidity with which we can sequence genomes, compare the genome, structural biology. There are papers published that already show how COVID-19 viral particle attaches to human cells. Quantitative biology is basically giving you the mechanisms once you find something. And the vaccine platforms, everything from RNA-based vaccines to traditional vaccine platforms. So that's one reason. Second, the translatability of laboratory models. Again, this is because it's a virus more than any other disease of interest, but they are highly translatable from in vitro to animal models. More importantly, this open access and rapid publications of emerging data. So there is, some of you might know about this database called Biomarker. just from the start of this year, if you do a search, there are more than 700 publications. So people just put out the data as rapidly as they can, even before they are published. And that generates a lot of collaborations. And finally, for the topic of today especially, the advanced data analytics is how I've captured it. AI is a component of that. But that's really shedding light on repurposing and redirecting opportunities with existing molecules. So you don't have to start from the very beginning, which may take time to find the right molecule. So if we go to the next slide on that same bio.org website, you'll see now how many molecules are being either redirected, means they aren't yet approved, but they've been redirected towards testing against COVID-19, or repurposed. So these are approved drugs that are also being looked at to see if they would be effective against fighting this pandemic. So with that, I'm going to engage Daniel into the conversation. He's deeply knowledgeable in the field of repurposing. And to start the conversation, I'd like to ask him to first describe how he sees the AI-based drug discovery and development, especially in this field of COVID-19. How do you define AI? Because it's like an elephant and four blind men, right? So let's start there.
Well, first of all, Kalpana, thank you for having me, and Priyata, thank you also for having me and the entire TIE organization. So yeah, for a definition for AI, I think we often have to be careful, and people who are practitioners today understand that true autonomous AI, it doesn't exist, right? And what we're really speaking about is truly machine learning and intelligent algorithms that are learning. And what's really important, and this is why we invested, and actually we invested in Repurposed AI around a platform that Dr. George Nicola had created, was because what's even more important necessarily than the definition between machine learning and AI in a practical sense is actually how we bias or we unbias data that goes into the training platforms, into the algorithms. So one of the things that happens is many companies in many different fields will talk about AI, whatever, AI fill in the blank. But what they do is they arbitrarily shrink data sets. So there are advanced techniques to sample data sets, or they put in biasing, meaning they apply human written rules that put guardrails on what the machine learning algorithms can learn, or where their knowledge base starts. One of the reasons that we were very interested in helping to build Repurposed AI is because Dr. Nicola had built painstakingly had built proprietary data sets from public data sets, which is not a trivial task, because most data sets that are available today are not machine readable. So in painstaking form, he did that. And then in the case of what we did, or for drug delivery, he created chemical fingerprints, which means he turned that data into sets of zeros and ones. And these strings, these bit vectors, are thousands, tens of thousands of bits long. And then what you did at that step, what often happens though, is that teams have done that before, but now what they say is that, look, we only can concentrate on cancer, or we can only concentrate on these type of things, or we're going to look to the literature and take this information from the pharmaceutical literature and apply these 10, 20, 100 rules to our algorithm. What Repurposed AI did is have learning that did not have any bias in it. Now, to say it's completely unbiased would also be a faux pas, as the data in itself coming out of the literature, of course, has some inherent bias in it. As we all know, not 100% of the data that's in the literature can be recreated, but you do the best that you can. And so by having the algorithms learn without biasing, the algorithms themselves were able to learn what was important and what was not important. And that's definitively been what has really propelled Repurposed AI in particular forward, and has increased the fidelity of the predictions that the underlying technology is able to make.
Right, that's very helpful. So with that kind of a platform, where do you see the biggest impact of finding the right drugs for COVID-19, right? So what aspect is it, starting with biology, chemical biology, looking for interactions, all of the above?
Yeah. So great question. And so in the case, there are at least a half dozen different approaches to AI-based drug discovery in the pharmaceutical sector. In particular, Repurposed AI uses a digital chemistry platform. And so in this digital chemistry platform, the predictions and the data sets, the original data sets, they're based on a fundamental understanding of the chemistry of a drug binding to a biological target. So our entire data set is based around the hundreds of thousands of drugs that are known to bind targets in the body, and then understanding the chemistry and the chemical interactions between that binding event. And so basically what happens is you end up with a data set that is hundreds of thousands of rows deep, and now is thousands up to tens of thousands of columns. And the columns that are in the data, those are the chemical descriptors of the molecules themselves on the other side, and the interactions of the drug molecule with the biological target. And that is what in our case is ultimately reduced to these bit strings that I was speaking about previously. So this is different, that our predictions at Repurpose are based on first principles, essentially physics and chemistry. There are other approaches. Some approaches use a genetics approach. Some actually use a text-based approach. And there's a number of other ones that are in between, but ours is a fundamental chemistry-based approach. Now, the second part of the question that I think is important is not just where you're starting, but where you're going. What you'll see, and I don't mean this to underestimate the level of thought that has to go in to repurposing many of drugs that are currently under clinical trials. But what you'll see in reality is that people will say, oh, we've discovered that this drug can work against COVID. And what you'll find oftentimes is the last three letters of that drug are VIR, right? And so what we have there is a drug that's already known to be an antiviral. And now they're saying, oh, well, this is an antiviral for malaria, or, you know, whatever, fill in the blank. I'm sorry, it's an antiviral. Let me take that back. It's an antiviral for fill in the blank virus, right? And what happens is they're saying, well, maybe this can work to prevent COVID infection or infection propagation in COVID. And so they'll repurpose it or reposition it in that way. What we're looking for are true novel discoveries, right? So drugs that don't end in VIR, drugs that aren't known today to actually attack the symptoms that we're seeing, right? So for instance, in children, we've seen a discerning trend of essentially a Kawasaki's disease, or Kawasaki syndrome, right, is popping up. We've seen this cohort out of New York. And so what we would be looking at is to take drugs that are not known to treat Kawasaki or anything like Kawasaki, and look for, based on fundamental chemistry, repurpose those drugs to treat that, because we understand the target that mediates the symptom progression, and we understand the chemistry associated with a drug binding to that target. So we're really looking for the stuff that's non-obvious. We're actually looking for the stuff that's non-obvious, that won't even show up on high throughput screens as well. So this is very important. So the things that we're doing AI, some people would say, well, we can do that with high throughput screening. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is literally 96 well Petri dishes where you're looking at drugs and drug combinations in a high throughput screen, you know, hence the definition. But those screens are notorious for missing much of the nuance binders that can occur. And it also oftentimes doesn't properly compensate concentration-based binding events, combinations of therapies, and other things that sort of the nuanced side of drug development. And we believe our technology platform, you can take off the drugs that end in VIR, you can take off the drugs that you found in a high throughput screen, and we're really concentrating on all those other drugs that are the non-obvious binders for targets that are related to COVID infection propagation, and the symptoms associated with COVID-19.
Do you have a time to match, Daniel? How long does it take you to find a match?
Oh, so that's
how this is speeding everything up and lowering the cost of these investments.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And so I will say we have created engines today, right? And so actually, interestingly enough, the biggest bottleneck at our point with the advanced cloud computing iterations of our technology platform that can exist, even the most complicated problems using supercomputers in the cloud, we can do the compute in hours or a max of 1 to 2 days, depending on the severity of the problem. Interestingly enough, the largest bottleneck that might occur is a full understanding of target biology, and also understanding known binders and known non-binders that are very important for this. And so what's very interesting is that the academic literature is notorious for publishing things that work. It's not so notorious for publishing all the things that they tried that did not work. But when it comes to true advanced AI, true non-binders or true negatives are just as important as true positives in what we're doing. So part of the trick is finding those from first principles, or creating synthetic data sets that can stand in for known negatives and known positives, right? And then you get into a compute power on top of that. Sometimes you're layering, if you will, machine learning on top of machine learning, and there's a layered process that you can take as well.
Kalpana, how does that match to your experience, this few hours to 1 to 2 days for a match? Is that what you're seeing across the board in AI?
It depends on the target and how much you understand the target biology, just as Daniel was saying. In this case, we understand a lot more, so it's consistent with that time frame.
Great.
Yeah, so we are starting with tremendous amount of knowledge, even from the other SARS viruses that came before CoV-2, right? So
that's right, and there's some highly conserved, sort of first principles biology associated with this SARS virus versus previous SARS virus, to your point, and that's been helpful. And also what has been a significant help is that the academic literature and the academic community has pushed quickly to map druggable targets for COVID-19. And that is part of the fuel that feeds these predictive engines. And so that is true not only for Repurposed AI, but for all AI drug discovery platforms that are working on this problem.
So I have a serious question to get to, but before that, did hydroxychloroquine come up as a positive or a negative binder? Just a poison.
I think I'll probably say no comment. I'll probably say no comment just to stay out of the politics of that question, but I appreciate you jumping from science and business into politics, Kalpana.
Sorry about that. I have to do it. But
let's just say that, as Brigitte knows, my wife is a practicing emergency physician on the front line of this pandemic, and we are not prophylactically taking that drug at home.
You answered it well. So moving into sort of a more commercial success kind of a question, how do you build in sort of IP in when you are doing repurposing, right? So most times the patents that are most defendable are with composition of matter.
Mhm.
So I'm sure, at Repurpose AI, you've thought about it. How are you building that in for eventual commercial success?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so I think the starting point is that there are 20,000+ drugs at best count that have successfully navigated a phase 1 clinical trial, through the modern history of the FDA, or European-based drugs, for instance. So those drugs are known to be safe and well tolerated generally, right, within certain guidelines. And so we primarily use that as our starting point. So a lot of biotech companies talk about our drug library is this big, our drug library is that big. So in our case, it's a 20,000+ compound library that we're starting from. And then at that point, so we know that they're safe. At that point, then what happens, you do have a bifurcation. So obviously some of those drugs have been approved, some of those drugs have been abandoned. The super majority of that 20,000+ compound library, they've been abandoned and they're not commercially available. So if you make a discovery in that space and the original composition of matter patent has expired, then you have freedom to operate to patent drug plus target plus indication. And so that's a place that you can start. So you can own that, and because the drug is not commercially available in a GMP, it can't be prescribed in that format, right? And then you have opportunities that may arise actually as what's going on right now with COVID, right? So the drugs that can get fastest to market are drugs that are currently on the market. The freedom to operate may technically be there because their composition matter has expired, but they're being produced in mass quantities by generic drug manufacturers. And so the drug is available, and there is a hypothetical situation where it could be prescribed off-label because physicians have prerogative there, right? But they would be prescribing a drug that would potentially not technically be approved. And so this is where what's going on now in repurposing is real, because you can discover that the drug does indeed bind the target. You can discover that it works, but the dosage form or the dosage amount might not be the same. And so there is some proprietary there. The FDA does have programs to provide, give you exclusivity into the area. But the truth of the matter is that in this current pandemic, when we're specifically solving for COVID-19, and there is an immediate need to get drugs to people, while we are a for-profit business and I am an investor, there is a public good here that is significantly part of this equation. And I think anyone working in this space that isn't thinking about that in that way is thinking about it the wrong way. And I will say that I think there's an implicit understanding that if you come up with therapeutics that solve COVID, the finances on that side will work themselves out in the long run, as well as a few awards, along the way, right? So there's some value in being the company or being one of the companies that saves the world. So we forge ahead because it's the right thing to do right now. We understand the patent laws. I agree with you, and it's a great question to bring up. And outside of COVID, I think it's even more important right now. We're trying to be humans, and because we have capabilities, because we've been blessed with opportunities to build a company like this, we forge ahead as humans, and not profiteers here.
Right, very commendable. Brigitte, should we move to other questions, or?
Let's do that. Thank you very much, Kalpana, for that nice interview. And thank you, Daniel, for all that information. I think that clearly, this is one of the very rare times where investors might be okay with that term that you use, that the finances are going to work themselves out. But the finances will work themselves out. So one of the questions that came in ahead of time was around the fact that how do you get attention from health systems when they're all busy today trying hard to get back to normal? Do you attack a different area of the health system? Have you found any changes there at all, Daniel?
So in short, yes. So I recognize, we have a large portfolio, tens of companies in it. And it would be wrong to say that each of them that interacts with hospitals or the payer system is smooth sailing, because the physical limitation of simply being there, especially if you have a widget that has to get in someone's hands and they need to feel it and they need to touch it, even if it's an IoT device, even if it's a digital therapeutic, those challenges are real. I will not say that they are not, but the biggest thing is that if you are solving a problem now that alleviates massive cost or creates revenue in this time, you will be heard. And I know that for a fact. I can't disclose the team, but we recently made an investment in a company that's actually seen some of their sales cycles go from 6 months to 6 days. And they've seen payers invest during COVID-19 into the company, right? On top of being customers with the company. And so that is real. And so that is truly happening. And I'll say, specifically for Repurpose AI, we see that specifically where Repurpose was something that we were having a lot of conversations with strategic pharmaceutical companies around it. And it was, positive but slow progressing. Since COVID-19 has occurred, people are moving to document meetings and moving towards LOIs and MOUs so that they quickly want to be at the front of the line and have exclusivity periods with companies like Repurpose or the ones that I mentioned previously, and want to get to deals very, very quickly. So the bottom line, if you create a value proposition now, and even more important than anything else, saving money is important, but if you are creating income in a time where income has fallen off a cliff for many areas, even within healthcare, where this is a healthcare crisis, you will be heard.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I even heard of a company that, believe it or not, applied for a grant, and the grant was approved in 4 days, and they received funds within 10 days. When this is a federal grant. How is that even possible? Completely different scenario.
Yeah, no, it's real. But this is, and I think, Steve, you brought this up as well earlier in the conversation. This is forcing where we've been investing at NextCube and Sway in digital healthcare. It was, in many ways, people said, this is a nice to have right now, and this is the future of healthcare. Well, the future of healthcare just became today, right? Yeah. And so things that people were expecting to be our reality in 10 years, they need to be our reality today. And so if you built one of those companies or built one of those products that now is a necessity, you're in a position, and nothing should slow down your sales cycle.
Yeah, I spoke to a guy who's senior in an IT company that is associated with the major payer, without giving anything away. And this was just earlier this week. And he told me that, all of the projects that he's been working on and having, a hard time getting people to pay attention to, suddenly there's a great deal of interest. So this is the big unfreezing. This is the defrosting that it's accelerating things and freeing up thinking to embrace new approaches and new ideas out of necessity.
Yep.
So one of the questions that came in from the chat column as well reminds us that the future is not evenly distributed. How do we manage an increasing digital divide? How do these products and services serve those that currently hold feature phones, not smartphones? you want to take that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to try and get to as many people as you can, but the digital divide is real. That's another thing that has become very clear during this time, particularly when you're looking at kids trying to get education online. And some kids are there with their Chromebooks at home in their little room in their office, and others are struggling to get by using a parent's smartphone, using a cell data connection. So there is certainly great unevenness out there in the digital world, digital haves and have-nots. But I think if we can pick the basic unit of computing, that's why I'm fond of this thing as being used for contact tracing and used for delivering as many medical services as possible. Yes, there are still some feature phones out there, but there are many people that now have access to low-cost smartphones, and that's why I think it's really important to bring in not just the Apples of the world and put contact tracing on an Apple Watch, but make sure it is on every basic Google smartphone out there too.
Great. And then one of the questions touched on the future of virtual visits. Clearly, in our refreeze state, as you termed it, I don't see virtual visits going away very much at all. I see the phone as being that first point of contact for everything, regardless of what it is, other than true emergencies where get an ambulance here now and let's move this individual. But they were asking for percentages. What percentage of visits do you think will be virtual visits in the future?
Too early to tell. It's going to come down to what the new normal settles as. If you look at what's happening with retail, online retail sales are up between 200% and 400%, depending on the retailer. Now, the in-store sales are obviously devastated, but you can imagine that kind of order of uptick. And once people find new, simpler ways to do things, you're absolutely right, Brigitte, they're never going to go back. Why would you want to go and leave work, go all the way to a doctor's office where you sit and wait and waste time, be coughed on by people around you, when you can schedule the time, make a call, and get the same thing done? I wouldn't be surprised if we see in excess of 50% of visits going that way. And in addition to the telehealth calls using smartphones, as we see more smart devices being deployed into homes to help monitor and support people with chronic health conditions, I think that also reduces the burden, reduces the visit count onto doctors' offices.
Great. Any questions from the panelists themselves? Some of these are moving into other territories that might take another session for us to cover. But,
well, I'll just add to what Steve was saying. I think what's happening, there's a forcing function now. So at the patient level, they're saying, wait a minute, I could get exactly the value I was getting before without sitting in, sitting in this office, pediatrician, my kids running around. They're saying, hold on, this is where this needs to go. I think the other thing that's happening that's really great as well is that we're not just going to telehealth, but now, because this is the forcing function, finally technologies are being taken seriously that allow virtual care to occur. And that means not simply a Skype call or a Zoom call with a patient and a doctor on either side of it, but we're talking about clinical grade devices, IoT devices that are in the house, always on, monitoring your health 24/7, and allowing you, frankly, to not have to worry too much about your health because it's tracking it, sending that to your doctor, using AI to triage that, and making your doctor aware when you're going off trends, and getting on-demand healthcare. So all of us cumulatively receive more healthcare, even though we're reducing the burden on physicians on an individual basis. And that's where it gets really, really exciting at that point, because then we're driving changes to outcomes, and we're also reducing the barrier to care, because, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, there's a small group of people in this country and globally that receive way too much healthcare, and then there's a large group that receive far too little. And between telehealth and these IoT devices entering the home and being on people, it completely flattens that curve, to borrow from a different use, right? That's where it becomes really exciting to me.
Yeah, and the more we digitize care, sorry, I want to come back to the more we digitize care, the more opportunity we have to explore outcomes. And so when we talk about individuals who have environmental situations in place that are less than optimal, we can track their health outcomes, and they're just as important to inform those that may have access to more robust environments, shall we say. So this new model of having this continuous AI or continuous machine learning from the population, so we move away from just thinking about evidence-based care to experience-based care, I think will really engender a massive lift in the intelligence we have around just practical things that we need on a day-to-day basis to ensure that all populations at least have access to those things that are so reasonable and make so much sense, but there was never any data around it. And so one of the questions was about Ayurveda and Ayurveda therapy. Does anybody in the panel have any insight yet as to how that might affect a COVID environment? I think, we generally understand COVID as being a pro-inflammatory and a pro-thrombotic state, and that maybe specific therapies like Ayurveda and others, we have some preliminary data around yoga, not specific to COVID, but very specific to pro-inflammatory disorders. And so I'm wondering if you have anything to add there.
So I have one example to give. There is a small startup company in India, where I'm originally from, has used AI, similar to what Daniel described, based on the structures of SARS-CoV-2 virus. And they've come up with natural Ayurvedic products that they've predicted would prevent the entry of the virus into human cells, or once it's entered, it would stop its propagation. So they are doing this from a philanthropy point of view. They've been funded by a philanthropist to develop these natural Ayurvedic substances as potential preventive treatment. The second one that you brought up, I was also going to bring up, and that is yoga-based therapies that are focused much more on the upper respiratory system. So this has already started with online Zoom calls here to strengthen, especially in the elderly and more vulnerable population with chronic cardiovascular or diabetic symptoms, to do that 30 to 45-minute breathing exercises to just strengthen upper respiratory system. So I think we're going to see more of these sort of outside of the mainstay therapeutic approaches, combining with the mainstay therapeutics to really deal with this kind of a pandemic. And the wonderful thing that's happened is so many people, as Daniel also said, are right now jumping into outside of commercial questions, right? And revenue questions, to say, this is a humanity need, and I'm going to do what I can to help out anyone and everyone who needs it.
To share the name of that company that you mentioned?
It's called BRL, Bani Research Labs. And I've connected them up to Oregon Health Sciences University here to get their molecules tested, replicated here, the data, even though they are testing it in India right now, because people do want to see replicated data.
Right.
So, yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
And then the question came in, which VCs are investing best in companies seeking early stage funding to bring COVID valuable products to market? Are there specific VC groups that you're aware of?
Well, of course, NextCube and Sway Ventures, of course, are at the top of that list. No, there are a lot of great firms in this place, and I think what's important, if you're an entrepreneur in this space, or you're thinking about launching a company, this actually is a great time. I can tell you for a fact that not only is this a good time, as I was mentioning, for many companies, some of which we've invested in, but actually from an investor point of view, we have had potential limited partners, right, that we've been speaking to. And now all anybody wants to talk about is tell us how you're invested in digital healthcare. Tell us how you're invested in the future of health. We want to invest more of our allocation that's going into venture into digital health, firms investing in the digital health space. There's been a number of mega funds that have been launched recently. Some places they call it bio-IT. And I know either allocations within funds or standalone funds themselves. Andreessen Horowitz has funds that they've launched. Section 32 just launched another fund. 8VC has a dedicated bio-IT practice from one of their large funds. So you know, in addition to what we're doing, these folks are clearly open for business and are investing in this space. And there's not only that, it's actually, this is the time that they want to be deploying capital, right? Especially at the earliest stages, because the numbers show over and over and over again, many great companies are launched in the middle of economic crises. And this is one of them. You go back and look, the companies that were launched in 08, 09, 10 during the Great Recession are now the big tech companies that we see today. Or you go from an Amazon, I think if you invested in Amazon during the middle of the Great Recession, you could have seen a 16x return on capital between now and then. People talk about, how do I get venture returns? As well, you could have invested in Amazon 10 years ago, right? So yeah, it's real. The LPs want to be invested in this space, which means the GPs and the investors, folks in my seat, are investing in these spaces. Are we dotting our I's and crossing our T's? You bet you, right? Diligence requirements have gone up. But those companies that are the best, they shine through in that process. But we have to double dot our I's and double cross our T's. So the process may be a little bit slower, but it is occurring in real time. I can raise my hand and speak to that. And I know those other firms that I mentioned and many that I have not mentioned are also open for business as well and are actively investing.
What about specifically investing in vaccines? Is that a high risk place for investors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, by background scientifically, I'm a scientist, a chemist originally. Spent a lot of time in the bio department as well. As an investor, we invest specifically. Our practice is in software-enabled healthcare. The biopharma VCs are really an industry unto themselves. Traditionally, there hasn't been a ton of investment in the development of companies bringing along new vaccines because the long-term profit margin isn't quite as high as looking at therapeutics or investing in CRISPR or the other. Every decade there's a new development technology that comes to play. But right, is that general partners are in business to find opportunities for their limited partners. And there's more than a few people that believe that what's going on right now is the beginning of a new normal where we're going to see more and more pandemics occurring. And so you can imagine if you're, I bet the people that invested in, Moderna right now, right, in their technology platform, to be specific, they're looking at it as, hey, there's going to be a future where it's COVID-19 right now, but it might be COVID-21 and then COVID-23 and then COVID-25. And if we have a platform that can rapidly produce these viruses, then we've changed the dynamics that said, hey, maybe I'm not interested in investing in vaccine companies. And so I mean that to say it has been occurring, right? Don't get me wrong, it has been occurring, but therapeutics, biologics have really been at the forefront. But this current environment may change that, and companies developing vaccine platforms may have an equal seat at the table moving forward with therapeutics, small molecule therapeutics, and biologics firms.
So in a word, you're saying maybe.
I think a lot of people, this will change people's thinking on investing in biopharma, the biopharma venture world. So I think there will be a natural reaction where I would expect to see more dollars flow into vaccines relative to the percentage that flowed in, say, the last 2 years.
Sure, sure. So
But I'm not going out on a long limb there either, probably.
And Daniel, what do you think about diagnostics? Diagnostics has always been the area that was kind of people shied away from. Do you see that changing?
Yeah, well, I think you do, right? Because hence what's in the news besides Moderna, right? And so what's in the news is you've got Abbott, right? And so Abbott was the savior. Now it's looking like they have a 20% false negative rate. Now Abbott, stinks, right? And folks are back and forth. But I think people are recognizing, and this is true with all diseases, right? Is that personalized health and responses to pandemics are both predicated on understanding the patient and understanding if there's been infection, which requires a diagnostic, or personalized medicine requires a diagnostic to be attached to it. And so I can see the world waking up, and diagnostics have had a seat at the table, but again, it's been underweight relative to other technologies. And I think it's clear you're going to see that folks are going to wake up and say it should be at least even weight with other technologies that they have in their portfolio.
Yeah, and I think though too, the other point is as we move to more and more virtual visits, it used to be that we used the lab to confirm the clinical suspicion that happened with the in-person visit.
Yep.
Now that we're not having in-person visits, that clinical suspicion becomes much less potent, and we are much more reliant on laboratory tests, and especially laboratory and IoT devices in the home. So we're getting towards the end of this. I thought I would give each of our wonderful panelists an opportunity to share two final words or two final sentences that you would like to leave with the crowd before we sign off and have Carrie thank our sponsors yet again. So shall we start with you, Steve, and then move to Patty, then Kalpana, and finish with Daniel, and then Carrie, I'll hand it back to you to thank our sponsors. Let's go ahead, Steve.
My final thought is it's a crappy time. It's stressful, it's difficult. We're learning a lot of lessons, but I think the biggest thing we're learning, other than maybe the world is more fragile than we had thought, is that we are an incredibly resilient species, and our ability to adapt and to embrace change is what will get us through, and the ability to drive innovation into every aspect of business and society, I think, is what will get us through. So while it was, when we have history for this, right? If you look at a lot of the stuff that came out of World War II, it was a time of incredible difficulty. But out of that came the modern jet industry, GPS satellites, all of that. So out of this time, I think a lot of really cool stuff is going to emerge. And the people on this call are the ones that are going to help make that happen.
Thank you, Steve. And Patty?
Yeah, I mean, I love this concept of unfreezing things that we're, with our old ways of thinking about it. And I just think that all of us, in a lot of things we do, instead of, wishing every week that it would go back to the old way, because I think this is going to last for quite a while, is really rethinking how do we do things differently. And taking advantage of those opportunities that, if your provider's not offering the kind of telemedicine visits you want, find one that will, because you're going to need it in the future, really seeking those opportunities. And I think the other thing is, I think all of us have come to realize how important our health is, that we really treasure, what we have, and, and our ability to be able to interact socially with our friends. So I just really hope that, Steve, you guys can come up with a way that we can unfreeze, but not unfreeze recklessly in a way that we're going to see a lot of people get sick again. And, I hope you can come up with some tools that will work for places like where we work in India or in Ghana or Nigeria, where, their problems there are really just, going up higher and higher. They don't have all the options that we do. So hope we can all work together on those.
Yes, let's not unfreeze into or refreeze into the past, because the past needed a lot of fixing. Absolutely. And Kalpana?
So along the same lines, I think this was a wake-up call that everybody has woken up to, and I don't think the world will be the same anymore. I'm a science geek, and I feel like the technological advances that were made in the last, 5 to 10 years are really being taken advantage of today, and we'll see more and more of that as we go forward. I've become an optimist in my old age, and I feel like just in the last 2 months, what I've seen, and I have greater confidence in the humanity than I ever did. But I think we'll see a combination of both the human drive that Steve talked about and the technologies changing how we live in this world anymore for the better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kalpana. Daniel, do you have 2 minutes?
Yes, sure, absolutely. And I think this won't be anything completely divergent from what the other panelists have said, but I think to maybe put it in perspective in terms of numbers, I was thinking about it the other day, is that this is the greatest health crisis in at least 40 years as related to HIV/AIDS, or 100 years as related to the Spanish flu. It's the greatest economic crisis in 90 years since the Great Depression. But it's arguably the greatest population health opportunity that we've had since the discovery of the smallpox vaccine about 220 years ago, right? So we're talking about, for anyone saying, where's history, or I love history, I wish I was a part of it. This is the time. This is your chance to step up and become part of history, and literally not just be a part of it, but write it. This isn't just generational events that are occurring. This isn't just potentially, once in 100 years. We're talking about an opportunity, both from a humanistic point of view and potentially a financial point of view, to build products and build businesses that will change the world, like the smallpox vaccine changed the world and set us on a completely different path. And so I encourage the folks here, however you can play that role. If you're an investor, support that entrepreneur. If you're someone who's an executive now, or saying, I have this idea, or I understand this technology, or I understand this space, I can do it better. Go do it better now, because it's literally is a disservice not to build those companies now, not to fund those companies now, and not build the world that we want. Because if the folks who don't, then we'll end up with a world that was built by folks who actually don't have the best intentions of others at bay, or actually are not necessarily the most deserving to do it. So, I think this is more of a challenge that's laid at the feet of the folks who can, to protect the folks who can't, and go build the world that you want to live in post-pandemic.
Absolutely. And even if it's been a while since you've been in medicine, research, or science, go ahead and pull up your sleeves and get back in and join them. We've got room for everyone. And just to swing it back to the beginning, immunity passports are inevitable. And I really appreciate the fact that we have technologies such as blockchain today to enable the privacy, security, and untamperability of immunity passports to be a reality. We do want to have an ability to open up the country and the world in ways that don't look like what we're doing right now. This needs to be a much more high precision event, which can protect each of us, and it shows our responsibility to protect each other as well. So look forward to doing something as difficult and complicated as immunity passports, but do it well, do it correctly, and do it with the ability to protect each of our privacy and security at the same time. Thanks again to our panelists. This has been very informative. I truly appreciate the time you've been able to give to our viewers, and I'll hand it over to Carrie to finish us up. Thanks, Carrie.
Yes, thank you again, everybody, for being here, and a special thanks to Brigitte, Kalpana, Steve, Daniel, and Patty. Your information was so valuable, and I think it's just really important to say, you know, it's from a really valued and trusted sources that we're hearing from. So again, thank you so much for being part of the TIE network. We really, really, really appreciate the information that you were able to provide to us today. Our upcoming events, we have Pitch Club tomorrow evening at 5:30. It will be done virtually, but this is a great way to practice your pitch because, as we heard, people are still investing. The light, you know, our lives will go on. The world has not ended, so let's continue to invest in those companies. So practice your pitch tomorrow evening at 5:30, and become a member. Again, playing off of what Daniel said, you know, we need to start building companies that will aid this pandemic, and TIE is here to help you. We are offering 6 months of complimentary membership through this time, so please reach out to me or just log on to oregon.tie.org and become a member and have the benefits of mentorship, access to investors, and events like these. A huge thank you to all of our supporters. Without them, events like this could not be possible. So if you are looking for an accountant, a lawyer, funding sources, please take note of who you see on the screen. Again, without them, we just could not produce events such as these. And thank you again so much to our panel, and Brigitte especially for putting this together. This is being recorded and will be up on our website before the end of the day. Thank you again so much. Have a good day.
Great. Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.